Steampunk. It's a genre of Victorian science fantasy with coal and clockwork, cravats and crinoline, and of course, goggles on a hat. But it's so much more than fiction. It's a rebellious philosophy. It's counterculture. It's a regressive colonial nostalgia. Is it? Only one way to find out. Follow me into the curious worlds of steampunk. Before we dive in, if you're new to the channel, Curious XP makes videos about subcultures and curious pastimes. If you'd like to help me make more of these videos, please take just a second to hit that subscribe button down below. Now, let's jump into the time machine and start at the very beginning. In 1987, author K.W. Jeter writes a letter about his latest novel, which happened to be a tale of foggy Victorian streets, clockwork automatons, and secret societies. It wasn't the first of its kind, but his letter said something that has been remembered.
I think Victorian fantasies are going to be the next big thing. As long as we can come up with a fitting collective name for authors like Powers, Blaylock, and myself. Something based on the appropriate technology of that era. Like Steampunks.
He was making a joke, referencing the hottest sci-fi genre of the 80s, cyberpunk. It was just a play on words, but the name stuck. Steampunk was quite simply 19th century retrofuturism, inspired by the science fiction of actual Victorians like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. Steampunk writers of the 20th century carved out a subgenre of science fiction that carried on imagining fantastical technology of steam and gears. Some steampunk writers explored the dehumanizing effects of industrialization, while others mocked the hubris of the 19th century with comedy. Many did both, and a dark comedic tone has stuck quite firmly to steampunk today. So the literary genre of steampunk was born in the late 20th century. But in the 21st century, a few decades later, it evolved into something more complicated, and it did so largely thanks to the internet. That's where I came into the scene. My first awareness of steampunk came with the gorgeous neo-Victorian computers of Datamancer, which were viral on the message boards of the early 2000s. I learned that the style was called steampunk, but at the time I had no idea where that name came from. Despite 20 years of literature that preceded it, this subculture really grew in the 2000s. It has not gone unnoted that this is also the dawn of the iPhone age. And look at the modern smartphone. Featureless, minimalist, inscrutable. The design of smartphones is the opposite of steampunk. Modern design strives to be 99% invisible. But steampunks are in love with details, ornament, moving parts. The idea of steampunk developed a sort of gravitational pull that drew people in from other subcultures to create a new one. Artisans from the Burning Man scene brought an emphasis on craft and makers. Neo-Victorian goths brought a lot of the fashion influences, and musicians of all kinds coalesced around steampunk. Most steampunks are aficionados of other nerdy things. They're often seen at Renaissance fairs and comics conventions, so it was only a matter of time before they created dedicated steampunk conventions, complete with entertainment, vendors, panels, cosplay. I'm pleased to live in an area with multiple annual steampunk festivals, including Jewelry City in Attleboro, Massachusetts, and Watch City in Waltham. It's interesting, though, that steampunk didn't have a pop culture canon to rally around the way that other cons do. Of course, there was the literature, and steampunk had made some mainstream waves with movies like Wild Wild West. But steampunks were more interested in sharing their own stories, their own original characters, steam sonas, if you will. And I've gotten my chance to create a steampunk story or two as well. I've had the chance to write immersive steampunk games to take place in fantastic locations. So now you have an idea of what steampunk is, but why? Why are people drawn to all of this? There is a sort of philosophy behind it, and it has a lot to do with our relationship to technology. Modern technology lets us down in two big ways. The first is its very invisibility. These inscrutable boxes, well, we use them every day, but could you pick your own phone out of a lineup? Not only do the phones look the same, but it's verging on a singularity. There's nothing to distinguish here, nothing to fall in love with. You're not supposed to fall in love. If you were in love with your device, you might not get the sequel. Planned obsolescence. Design for the dump. It makes companies a lot of money, but it's not what we want. We want to repair, to hack and customize. And there was a time when we had a different relationship with our technology, and we want it back. That's why the past holds this allure. But of course, that brings us to looking at the past through rose-colored lenses. Let's talk about that. The writers that K.W. Jeter mentioned in his famous Steampunk letter as his cohort, well, they all had a lot in common with each other. They were all white men of a similar age and background. Now, even in the 80s, the world of steampunk wasn't entirely homogeneous, but it's worth considering why the 19th century might hold more allure to some than others. It's true that 19th century Europe had pretty things in it, but it was also, of course, a zenith of exploitation. Exploitation of nature by industry, of the poor by the rich, of women by men, and entire continents by force. So are steampunks simply putting on rose-tinted goggles to look back at the golden age of patriarchy, colonialism, and racism? Well, I would be lying if I told you I had never met a steampunk with those tendencies. But here's where I think an accident of history steers us in the right direction. The word that stuck with us was steampunk. And that word has some power. Punk is rebellion. Punk is anti-authoritarian. As early as 2007, Steampunk magazine, which was foundational to the subculture, opened with an assertion that steampunks were colonizing the past so we can dream of the future. And steampunk is fantasy, not history. So we can imagine whatever we want. We can imagine a do-over. Imagine a past where queer people, people of color, women were not marginalized and had equal opportunity to contribute to the fields of mad science. We all benefit from different ideas and voices coming into the space, and from the internationalization of steampunk. There's literally a whole world of aesthetic possibilities. And that's it for our whirlwind tour of the curious worlds of steampunk. If you enjoyed the ride, give us a thumbs up. If you're a fellow steampunk, say hello in the comments. Let people know we're real. That's it for me. Until the next time, go forth, explore, experiment, and as always, stay curious.